Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen webcast. Uh, a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. If you are watching this on YouTube, if you could take a moment and hit subscribe, like, and the alert button on the video, if you haven't done it already, that helps the algorithms in YouTube to spread this to more people. It's the number one metric that they use to distribute this widely. If you're, I think at this point, most people listen to these podcasts through the podcast apps. And if you're part of that cohort, you can go to simplicityzen.com and sign up for the mailing list, which I've not been that great about sending out, but I'm gonna start getting better at that. Also, I love to hear from people about these podcasts. So if you want to contact me, you can reach out there. Also, I wanted to say that Tim has transmission in a Korean lineage, but it dawned on me that the interviews I've done so far are way too Japanese and oriented. So if you know of any, or if you are a Korean lineage holder or Vietnamese or so forth, I'd really appreciate you reaching out, or if you could make an introduction. I'd like to have more variety in our guests. I think that's all the housekeeping thing. So I'd like to introduce our guest today. Our guest is Ryuko Langdell. He's a board-certified hospice chaplain and is both the head priest and the guiding teacher at the StillCenter Zen Center in Pasadena, California. His dharma name, Ryuko, means dragon tiger. He holds a Master of Divinity from Claremont College in Theology and a Ph.D. in Psychology from the University of College in London. He is the author of several books, including Beginner's Mind, An Introduction to Zen Buddhism, and Christ Way, Buddha Way, Jesus as a Wisdom Teacher, and a Zen Perspective on his teachings. He has transmission to teach Zen from multiple lineages, including Clear Mind Zen, which is a part of the Japanese Soto lineage, as well as Korean and Vietnamese Zen traditions. And I'm sure we'll go into details about those during our talk. Additionally, he's most recently been made an assistant Zen teacher in the Open Mind Zen school, which is in the White Plum tradition. So essentially, he's an assistant koan teacher in that tradition. Thanks so much for joining us today, Tim.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah, and I didn't mention it in the little introduction there, but you're also a kind of Reformed Catholic priest. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah. So Reformed? No.
I mean, Reformed in the sense that it's not part of Catholicism as an institution.
Yeah. I know. I just was. There's going to be the danger in this podcast that I'll slip into British humor. I promise to do my best not to.
Okay.
We like puns and we like playing with words. So quick comment first. Thank you so much for doing this series of podcasts. I think you've made a tremendous contribution to Zen here in the West. I think I've learned so much about my colleagues in Zen that I didn't know. And I don't know how else I would have known about it if it weren't for you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's StillCenter Zen here in Pasadena. I think it says Stillwaters. Doesn't matter.
I'm sorry. There's a Stillwater in Vallejo, and I know the teacher there. And
yeah,
that's probably what I probably slipped in the time.
Easy mistake. We'll get back to it in a bit. But I'm in the independent Catholic tradition, we'll probably cover that as we go through it more chronologically. But it's part of the independent Catholic tradition that broke away after the in about the late 1800s when the Roman Catholic Church in Rome declared the Pope infallible, and a very large section of Catholic churches around the world decided that no human being is infallible, including the Pope, and hence the schism. And so we're part of that schism. But I'll talk a bit more about it later when we get to it.
What if you could remind me when we get there? I'm really curious. I'm always kind of interested to hear how people reconcile different worldviews of basically life after death and in Buddhism and Christianity when they kind of are working within the context of both traditions. And I've never really asked anyone that, and I'm kind of curious what your take will be on it. You can address it right now if you want, or we can just wait until we kind of get to that chronological aspect of your life. So either ways.
Yeah, can you ask me that a little bit later?
Sure.
Because that is one of my soapboxes. And if
Okay.
you've got 3 hours, we can go on that one topic alone, because
Okay.
that's partly what my Christ Way Buddha book is about.
Okay.
And that was a condensation of several tens of thousands of pages down into book size.
Mhm.
So yeah, I often give talks on that exact topic.
Okay.
So yeah, let's return to that,
Okay,
if I
great.
may. Yeah.
All right. So let's kind of dive into your life a little bit. So I take it you were born in New York, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. The old country.
Yeah. Or just York, maybe.
I was born in the 50s into the university city of Oxford. Um, Obviously famous for its university, along with Cambridge, the two leading university cities in Britain. It's a little bit difficult for people who haven't at least visited Britain, or indeed been raised there, to appreciate what Oxford represents. But if you're trying to imagine merging together Princeton and Harvard with Detroit,
Hmm.
because it's also the home of one of the biggest British motor car manufacturers, Austin, British Leyland, used to be known as Austin Morris, that sort of thing. So it's a huge working city, working, active factory city, as
Hmm.
well as being this highfalutin um, center of learning with 31 colleges all together. A fact I didn't learn until I left Oxford,
Yeah.
and years later was asked the question, how many colleges in Oxford? And I didn't know the answer.
Mhm. I have a quick question about Oxford.
Yeah.
A lot of times British accent seems to correlate both to geography and kind of socioeconomic class to some degree.
Yeah.
So, are there two Oxford accents? Is there the kind of the aristocratic Oxford accent and the more the working class Oxford accent that you can determine? I know this is
No,
total tangent, but I'm just kind of
it's
curious.
not a tangent. I was actually just going to address that, because you've nailed it. When I mention Oxford to people and I
Mhm.
say I was born there, most people, even people from England, don't go, wait a minute, you don't sound like you're from Oxford.
Mhm.
In fact, on the contrary, I think they tend to say, yeah, you sound like you're from Oxford, which is a pity, because I don't sound remotely like I'm from Oxford.
Mhm.
And there's a good reason for that. I was born into an upper working class, lower middle class family. And again, people here in the States, uh, unless you've actually experienced it, I don't think you can really know what the class system is all about. You
Mhm.
can read about it in books, but when you live it, it's a totally different thing. So I was
Mhm.
born into a family where, and it's in danger of getting into Monty Python type territory, but you're born and you know your place, and you
Mhm.
know from societal messages and subtle pressures on you that you should know your place and respect it and not try to deviate from it.
Mhm.
There are people who try to act better than themselves, by which they mean they may be working class pretending to be middle class, or middle class pretending to be upper class.
Mhm.
And it's heavily frowned upon.
Mhm.
You're born into a strata of society where there are expectations limited to that strata.
Mhm.
So to put this in perspective, um, my mother and father did not graduate high school. They both left school around 13, 14 years of age.
Mhm.
And soon thereafter, World War II happened. So when they were still pretty young, um, I suppose I should know the exact age, but probably around 19, 20, 21, that sort of age, they got, it was World War II. Um, I went to a local school, which
Mhm.
was, the high school was known as a secondary modern. And even our schools had two-tier systems. So the secondary modern school was for the hoi polloi, was for the
Mhm.
average person, working class, lower middle class. And then if you were a person of learning, raised in a good home, with parents who probably went to college, you went to a grammar school
Mhm.
or a private school, which is known in Britain as a public school. Bear with me, British language can get complicated. So,
It's okay. I've read
yeah,
Harry Potter, so and all
Yeah,
about
right. Well, if
the
you've read
British
Harry
educational
Potter
system.
and watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you basically know everything you need to know about Britain.
Okay.
And so I was born into a world where the expectation was I was going to work in the local car factory, which is where my father worked. He worked his way up from being a motorcycle mechanic when he was young. He actually was quite a famous motorcycle mechanic because there was a British motorcycle racer called Mike Hailwood, who nobody over here would know, but cars it was Sterling Moss, and for motorcycles it's Mike Hailwood. And my dad repaired and tuned the bikes for Mike Hailwood, so it's kind of an important point. But he then went from there to get a regular job at the local car factory, Austin Morris, and worked his way up from working on the line to being a supervisor. So kind of working his way up to a blue-collar job from a very much working-class job. And it was assumed I'd follow suit. That was the expectation. I was doing well. Sorry, I back up a step. I had the most unbelievable luck when it came to high school. And I've had luck every now and again throughout my life, which I still don't understand, but I really am deeply grateful for it. Around the age of 11, you do something called, surprisingly, the 11 plus in Britain, or at least you used to. And it's kind of like Harry Potter sorting hat. If you do well in the 11 plus, you go to the grammar school. And if you don't do well, you go to the secondary modern, and you're labeled as a tech, somebody going into a profession, teacher, secretary, working in a factory. And I was borderline. So I went to an interview to decide which of the two schools, as it were, that I was going to be sorted into. I remember turning up incredibly excited about Doctor Who, which, looking at my younger self, I totally get it. I was totally into science fiction. How could I not talk about Doctor Who? But they decided, oh no, this guy is too creative. He is not a serious scholar. So we'll stick him in the secondary modern. Almost coincidentally at the same time, the British government decided to invent a thing called the comprehensive school. And it was a merger of secondary modern and grammar schools into one school. And so the local grammar school got merged into our secondary modern school, and we became a hybrid grammar school, which is, as I say, absurdly lucky for me, because had I gone to secondary modern, pure secondary modern, they wouldn't have even trained me remotely to get into a college. I wouldn't have taken the necessary courses to go to college. So I went to the school. They had to hire brand new teachers who'd actually been educated in colleges, go figure. And the short version of that is that I did well, and I did well alongside the grammar school students. And as it happens, I excelled in physics and math. And I was able to go on to university. I chose the University of Leicester because I was interested in physics and astronomy, and Ken Pounds at Leicester was the leading person looking into black holes in space. And so that really drove me. I became the first person in my village to ever go to college, ever. Again, just put it in perspective. And during that period, so I'm getting back around to your point, I realize that I'm a bit long-winded, apologies. During that period, I realized that when I spoke with a normal accent, like when I was like with my Oxford accent, nobody could understand the bleeding word I was saying. So as I worked through that period of my life, realizing that I needed to be understood by other people, I dropped my Oxford accent, which sounds a lot more like a pirate speaking than the accent I just tried to do. I was helped a little bit by the fact my mum spoke a bit like that. She always spoke like she had a somewhat proper accent. We never did work out why. And yeah, so if you like, I could continue with sort of my journey and how it led me to Zen. Any questions?
I do have two questions.
Yeah.
The first is a kind of a digression. When you were talking about the the very stratified class system,
yeah,
it made me think of the there's the kind of the famous anecdote where a Westerner, probably an American, mentioned to the Dalai Lama about kind of like having feelings of like self-hate or not liking the self, and the Dalai Lama just couldn't understand it. It was like so outside of, like, not just because maybe any sort of um prajna or wisdom or anything, but just culturally just didn't get the point of not liking yourself or having kind of negative self beliefs. And I was watching there's this YouTube channel called Doug's Dharma. It's kind of a secular Buddhist YouTube thing, which is it's, some of it's amazing. When he tries to get into Mahayana, it falls apart brutally. But but his stuff on the early Buddhist teachings is pretty solid. Or at least I think so. But anyway, so he had an episode on this issue, and one thing he pointed out, I think this is where I heard it at least, was that in a lot of cultures, your place in your place in society, and that's just where you are and you feel comfortable. Where in kind of younger cultures like America, where there's fairly at least more class, what's the phrase I'm trying to think, where you can move up and down social strata,
social mobility.
Social mobility. Since that's a possibility, and you can also drop down pretty easily, based on a recession or whatever. People don't know their place in society, and so that creates a sense of insecurity. And so I thought that was an interesting theory of the kind of the social, the cultural mismatch between that speaker and the Dalai Lama. I'm curious if you have any, having lived in England and the United States, if you have any insight into those ideas.
Well, totally. It reminds me, I know it, of that high school experience, because we were lucky enough to get some teachers that were pretty good. They'd at least been to college, whereas all the secondary modern teachers may not have even finished high school, and they're teaching high school, which is British education system for you, the haves and have-nots. I remember my chemistry teacher was really proud of himself. He'd been to college and he was so much superior to all of us. And he's very aware that most of the kids in the room were secondary modern kids, and a few of them were grammar school kids. And he made a math error on the blackboard. And I have a bad habit. I should probably keep my mouth shut. But I stuck my hand out and said, "Sir, you've made an error in that math equation." And he just tore into me. "Langdell, I got a college degree. I did chemistry with a minor in math. You are never even going to get to college. So you do not get to correct me." And in that moment, I decided to prove to him wrong. I was going to go to college, and I was going to, flash forward a few years later, I got Master's, Ph.D, goodness knows what. Excelled in math at college, went back to the school, said, "See, you told me I'd never make it." And he said, "Sorry, who are you?" I don't remember having you as a student even, let alone saying that. So he didn't know that he was the grit in the oyster shell that created whatever. If this is a pill, I don't know if this is a pill. But it's, and you've also reminded me that because of my passion for physics and the sciences, I joined the British Young Science Association. I'm probably getting the name slightly wrong, but British Young Scientists, something like that. And when I got into it, it was dominated by these very well-spoken public school, grammar school kids who had silver spoons in their mouth, were driven to the meetings by the chauffeur in the Rolls or something like that. And that was the other critical point where I had to change my accent, because where I grew up in Kidlington, which is just outside of Oxford, which happens to be where Mr. Branson of Virgin fame lives as well. So we've got good company, Richard Branson. We spoke in things like double negatives and say, "I don't know nothing about that." That would be the standard way we speak. And they laughed at me. I was laughed at by these people, even though academically I could match them. the moment I opened my mouth, they couldn't take me seriously. So I did change my accent for that reason. And I made it my goal over the time I was in Britain. We moved to America in the beginning of the 1990s, but that period up to then, through the end of the 80s, I made it my goal to have friends in British society from all strata of British society. So I had some great friends who would say that they're working class, so there's middle class. And I know some sirs and lords and ladies, and I've moved in those circles. And I quite frankly, the class system horrifies me. The idea that you're born into a certain strata with expectations, limitations, privileges, or the lack of them. It exists to some degree in this country, but it's quite horrible in Britain. Sorry, British viewers, if I'm criticizing our homeland, but we've got many, many good qualities, but the class system isn't one of them. Yeah, should I tell you a little bit more about how this whole thing got started? Because it.
Yeah.
Or you got another question?
Yeah, I have another question. So, so as a child, talk a little bit about the kind of the religious context of your household. Were your parents religious?
Yeah.
You know, what was your relationship to Father Christmas?
But careful, you're yeah, holy ground there. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So again, I have an atypical background. My mother, an atypical background.
A native.
So atypical, unusual. Yeah. My mother was half deaf and my father was half blind. He only had one eye, and my mother had marginal hearing out of one ear only. And that colored my upbringing in ways that is hard to convey. It affects people when they have a disability like that. So I had a roller coaster ride of experience with my parents. My mother was a devout Christian, and she took my sister and I to church every Sunday. And she was a backbone of the church. She was the lady that made the coffee during the social hour afterwards. And my father would sit at home, and I remember to this day, absolutely classic quote from him was, I won't say it with all of the profanity in it, but basically, if there is a God, he's as much in this room here in this house as he is in that building up the road. And that was his attitude towards religion, which in a sense I have some sympathy with, as the years have gone by. But I was a difficult child. I'm sorry. But at the age of 10, you go through the equivalent of, in the Catholic world, would be First Communion. And we have this, the series of classes we have to go to pass in order to then be allowed to go up and take communion. And we had this priest who I think in hindsight was fresh out of seminary. And he thought he would impress us. I mean, we're 10-year-olds, for goodness sakes, by saying Jesus, or his actual name was Yeshua. It's always, he'd show off that he knew Jesus's quote unquote real name. And I don't know to this day where I got it from at age 10, because I can't believe I was reading that widely. But I said, hang on a minute, Yeshua, that's translated elsewhere in the Bible as Joshua. Why is it translated as Jesus in the New Testament? And he didn't have an answer. He basically said, be quiet, Langdell. This is about getting you through to First Communion, as it were. We didn't call it that. And you can ask those questions later.
Was this the Church of England? Or,
yeah. Sorry. So I've grown up in Church of England.
Okay.
And it's, so I'm blocking on the name of that process right now. But that was another pivotal moment for me, because I thought, wait a minute, they're not telling us the truth in this church. So I got interested in theology. But it also caused me to go interestingly, away from Christianity and more deeply into it at the same time. So I stopped going to church in my teens. My mother stopped taking us, and I didn't go of my own volition.
Were you a believer? Like as a child, did you believe in God? Like unreservedly?
I was a questioner.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely felt there was something in it, but I was pretty sure it wasn't what they were saying up in that brick building at the top of the road that was called a church. Mm-hmm. So I started off being somebody who was always asking questions, so seeking, and not really accepting what I was being told. And in fact, I believed that there had to be something more to it. That's basically my feeling. And I want to mention this for me, again, I consider myself to be really lucky to have come of age, as it were, in that period of 1968 to 1973. That took us through the peak and falling off of the flower power era, which I got caught up in the late stages of. It was a period of some incredible music, still my favorite music to this day, the late 60s and early 70s music. And what it also did was it brought me into contact with some incredible teachers. In
Actually,
England,
sorry, I'm gonna apologize. I want to ask a few more questions about your childhood. If that's
sure.
Yeah. So did you? So you were, as far as religion goes, you didn't have a firm belief in Jesus or God. Is that true?
I hadn't formed one.
Were you more atheist or more agnostic, or?
I think agnostic is the best description, because I wasn't in any way rejecting it. I mean, we were going to church every Sunday, and I could see that it made people happy, and it made people it seemed to bring comfort into their lives. So I thought, well, there's something in this. But I always felt uncomfortable with the basic theology that I was being given. So it was definitely an agnosticism, and it was a passion and interest for finding out more, not just about Christianity, but about what else is out there, really. Yeah.
So, how would you characterize your kind of demeanor as a child? Were you happy and outgoing? Were you more serious and introspective? Were you did you just totally geek out on books? You had an early interest in science and technology. Were you kind of a bookworm? Like, how would you characterize your personality and kind of mental states as a younger child and then a teenager?
Good question. Generally very happy, but very introverted, very shy. I had a few close friends, and that was it. And I would say that I continued much like that into my teens. And just try and recollect something about the teenage years. Quite early on, I found that even as a teenager, you could probably get into university events in Oxford. So I and some friends would gate crash those. But whilst there was a lot of alcohol around, drugs around, I didn't want to do that.
So you never went to drinking or phase?
Well, I drank socially. I think I maybe got drunk once and really hated the experience and couldn't figure out why anyone would want to do that themselves. But I was pretty shy. I think through my teenage years, and I opened up really at the end of the teenage years as I went to university. And I don't recall the transition particularly. I just decided, although I am by my nature an introvert, I'm going to be super friendly to people, and I will. And I found that I enjoyed talking to people in crowded situations, and it was comfortable. In fact, sometimes more comfortable speaking to a room of 1,000 people than I was talking to a small group of 2 or 3 people. So I think fairly early on, I discovered I'm an extroverted introvert, and there are a few of us around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so did you, kind of where you're getting up to your college years, did you try any psychedelics? Was that part of the
No.
milieu at the time?
So living in Kidlington, this is, although I was talked about going to this school where there were kids from a quite different social economic background
Mm-hmm.
attending, all of the people around me in the village, I mean, it's a huge village, it's really more like a city, a town at least, were primarily working class. So they weren't really into that. They were into drinking and smoking, just regular tobacco. I tried smoking, didn't like it. Tried cigars, didn't like it. But my first experience of drugs was at university, and um, that was, to me, I walked into a world I didn't even know existed.
Mm-hmm.
Leicester, people again may not be familiar geographically with where cities are in Britain, but Leicester, where I went, is pretty much smack in the middle of Britain.
Mm-hmm.
There is a divide in Britain between the south and the north. Some people say the north begins after Watford Gap or whatever it was called, but certainly by Leicester, you then hit that sweet spot where the people attending the university are as likely to have come down from the north as to come up from the south.
Mm-hmm.
So I was surrounded by northerners who I could not understand a word they said.
Mm-hmm.
I briefly got very friendly with a guy who spoke in a very broad Newcastle accent, which, if you've ever heard it, is completely unintelligible. And I hung around with him. He's my best buddy because we both did math together.
Mm-hmm.
Until later, somebody said, "Why are you hanging around with the biggest drug dealer on campus?" I had no idea that's what he was doing. He would just hand packages to people, and I thought, oh, he's helping people. I was naive, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I know I'm jumping forward actually to the beginning of college. I'm actually jumping past something else. But in that first year, I decided very early on I had a choice to make. Many of the people around me in my hall of residence were dropping LSD frequently. They needed somebody to stay sober to bring them down if they were having a bad trip. And I volunteered to be that person. So I never took it myself. But I had sugar cubes and all the other paraphernalia I needed to help somebody come down if they were having a bad trip.
So to this day, you've never tried psychedelics?
No, nor would I. I've seen the results of it. I've seen people think that they've opened up an area of their mind, and maybe they have. But the problem is it was opened up not through a natural evolutionary process, through practice like Zen. It's opened up chemically. And it is different. I've had similar experiences that I've had with extremely bad bouts of flu, for instance, where I've been which I had often in Britain, where I couldn't eat and drink for a week. And you get to a point where you're basically almost hallucinating. And you can have these moments of absolute euphoria that are, in a sense, chemically induced by the flu and the absence of food and drink. And they can give you a window, an insight, but there's a grave danger that you think that's the way to go. And thankfully, nobody's ever proposed, let's spread flu as a way of getting to enlightenment. But they have mentioned using psychedelics, which I'm not personally in favor of. In this, I'm actually jumping topics. If I could back up a second, because I'm going to come back to this in a moment. I went to college to do physics with a couple of concentrations of astronomy and computer science, and also quantum mechanics. Actually, those are the main areas that I was focusing on. And during my first year at college, I was surrounded I was basically the only scientist in the dorm. Everyone else was social scientists, and they were all many of the people I admired the most were taking psychology. A few of them were taking comparative religion. So before the end of that first year, and again, I need to back up slightly. When you go to college in Britain, I don't know if it's changed much now. You go just for 3 years, not 4. And you go primarily to study your primary topic. So my primary topic was physics. So it's 3 years of physics, right? And what you end up with after 3 years is called a bachelor's degree, but it might be closer to a bachelor's and master's here because you haven't got that intense focus on your main topic in the 4-year university here as we have in Britain. So I went to study physics. And by the end of the first year, I had attended nearly every comparative religion class as well, skipping my physics classes because I figured I could pass the exams without studying. Turns out I had to do an awful lot of reading all night to catch up on all that. But I thoroughly loved the comparative religion. I started attending the psychology classes. And by the end of the first year, I decided, oh, this is it. I want to become a psychologist as well, not instead of. So I went to talk to the board of trustees at Leicester University and basically said to them, I'd like to start a psychology degree. And they said, great. So it's a pity because you're at the end of your first year of physics. You're only funded for 3 years. So you'll have to go and get your local county council to approve that they are actually going to pay for you to now do 3 years of psychology. And are you sure you're all right? Because are you having trouble with the physics and you want to self-diagnose by taking the psychology classes? And I said, no, you misunderstand me. I want to add psychology on. I want to do 2 degrees in parallel. I think at that point they decided I was mad. Maybe I was, I don't know. But they foolishly said, well, if you can get the finance from Oxfordshire County Council to do 2 degrees, then go for it. We won't stop you. I got the money. To this day, I don't know how I got it because it would be very unusual. So I started my psychology degree 1 year out of synchrony with my physics degree. And it was in that year, that transition year, that 2 things happened. One, I met a British friar from the Franciscan order. And that's when I was introduced to Christian mysticism. I was reading Evelyn Underhill about mysticism and a few other books that were out at that time. And I thought, yeah, this is my view of Christianity. It's not that Christianity we hear about in the church on Sunday. It's this. It's about union with God. I'm interested in this. I'm going to follow it. So I became a life vows in your Doris and Francis at that age, around there. At the same time, I was introduced to the person I call my first Zen teacher, and it's a chap called Douglas Harding, which I believe most people would not have heard of him, which is a pity because he is an absolutely remarkable person. I called him my Zen teacher because I do believe that where he was as a master. But he had a very good approach to Zen. And he had the book he wrote was called On Having No Head. And I won't attempt to introduce people to his teaching here. But it was in that first year of psychology, at the beginning of 73, that he came to give a talk to us at Leicester University. And he gave his talk about having no head. And it had such a profound impact on me that as I walked out of the psychology building when the talk had happened, I had what I now would call a Kensho experience. I think it's probably Kensho. Mind and body dropped away. I was just in the moment. I don't know how long it lasted. There was a sensation of knowing, deep knowing that of being one with everything. Colors were brighter, sounds were more crystal clear. I remember the cherry blossoms on the trees in the courtyard. where I could see every single petal and so much clearer than usual. And what happened at that moment was that I entered a really deep state of peace, of certainty that regardless of what's going on, everything is okay. It's all well. And this was one of the other major blessings of my life. That feeling has never left me to this day. That sense of peace has stayed with me, which I am unbelievably grateful for. But that threw me headlong into Zen. So following,
prior to that lecture and that experience, you mentioned you'd taken comparative religion courses. So had you had some academic exposure to Buddhism?
Yes, I'd had some exposure to Buddhism, to Zen in particular, to Sufism, and I was already formulating my own thoughts about the fact that the mystical side of every religion has an awful lot in common. Very similar messages. Yeah.
Do you remember which Zen books or Zen, Zen, what Zen material did you have access to at that point?
Yeah, this was the realm of Alan Watts. I read everything by Alan Watts, and D.T. Suzuki, Christmas Humphreys, who did a wonderful little introduction to Zen Buddhism. And most people don't know him, but he was one of the founders and mainstays of the British Buddhist Society.
Yeah, I think maybe the first Zen book I ever read was Christmas Humphreys, or maybe the second. Yeah, I think 3 Pillars of Zen was my first.
And 3 Pillars, yeah. And so I'd read those. I'd also read Taoism. They went deeply into Taoism, and I immediately saw the parallels between Taoism and Zen. So it was a time of all of us having to own the I Ching to have a copy of. Carry on.
When you had that experience in the courtyard after the class, did you make any? Were you like, oh, this is interesting, or did you kind of when you came down to earth a little bit, did you think like, oh, this is a Zen experience, or this is Buddhism, or were you not even thinking those terms?
And again, I had, in that moment, to me, it all came together. That is to say, I felt at one with God. I also felt that I'd experienced my true self, and that they were the same thing, no difference. So at that moment, my Christianity and my Zen converged. And that's when I did the deep dive into being a third order member of St. Francis. And I also started up a Zen group at Leicester.
Had you done any meditation up to this point?
Yes, I've been doing, a group of us have been doing casual meditation. It was not very serious. There was, we were, experimenting with yoga.
On the university, at the university.
Yeah, at the university. It was a wonderful place for me to be at that time, because I was surrounded by people that were, yes, there were the people taking drugs, but there were also the tail end of the hippie era, where people were searching for peace and love and peace. I know it sounds also naive at this point, but they were searching for ways to achieve that. And that's where I got introduced to the followers of Douglas Harding, and got introduced to some of the people that were working with Christian mysticism and having groups. And we were having meditation sessions that were a cross between what you might now call centering prayer, where there was silent Christian meditation, but it was also in the Zazen format. But I formalized it. The one thing I'm a little unclear about at this distance in time is I recently found a letter addressed to me at Leicester, addressing me as president of the Buddhist Society. And I have a hazy recollection of that. I think what happened was I also formed the Leicester University Buddhist Society, or at least was president of it. It does kind of ring a bell.
Yeah.
But I formed this.
I'm gonna grab something and keep it. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, keep going. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah.
So I formed a Zen group, and I did so in coordination with Throstle Hole Priory, briefly with Jihu Kennett, but mainly with another man. And I've tried to recollect who that was. I think it may have been Daishin Morgan. It was somebody who was more resident at Throstle Hole. That had only got going the year before in 72, and this is 73.
So Kennett was living in England at the time?
I remember meeting her once.
Uh-huh.
It has to have been in England because I didn't go to the States till the middle of 73, unless I met her after I went to the States. It's mainly a man that I met with at Throstle Hole, and
Throstle Hole, is that her?
That's her. Yeah, the British Centre that she set up.
So that was kind of Soto in a way, right?
It describes itself as Soto. Yeah. So we set up as Soto.
And would you go visit there at their? Do they call it a priory or whatever?
Yeah, they call it a priory. Yeah, a few times. I was really immersed though in getting things going at Leicester. That was my first and foremost concern. My memory is that I did my best to look around England for where is there Zen, and was having a difficult time finding it. So that's why I was getting something going. I found Throstle Hole, what was new. We found Beshara, but Beshara was a little bit more Indian philosophy, Vedanta, rather than certainly not Zen, I don't think. But it was used as a retreat center.
How about Christmas Humphrey's group? Was it the Buddhist Society?
Exactly. Yeah. So I traveled to London, and I was all excited to go and visit the British Buddhist Society at their offices. And my memory is that it was this dusty, dim office in middle of London, with an elderly lady dressed in tweeds was the only lady there, and she had pamphlets on Buddhism to give out, but she herself knew nothing about Buddhism. And Christmas was not around to talk to. He may not have even still been alive by then. I'm not quite sure. And no, they had never heard of Zen sittings or anyone doing Zen anywhere in London. That was mid-70s. But what the major next step for me was that having not found Zen in Britain, other than Throstle Hole, which was just getting going, I had to go to what everyone was telling me was the epicenter of Zen, which is in America. So that summer, I came to California.
So you came to. So your impetus to coming to America was Zen. Yeah. Okay.
So I came over to attend primarily Zen Center of Los Angeles and Tassajara. I spent a brief period of time in Tassajara, but the rest of the time in Zen Center of Los Angeles. So very much.
Was Maizumi around at the point?
Maizumi was there, Bernie was there, and a few other people whose names I've forgotten. I was wet behind the ears, a Brit, hair down to my waist, gold rimmed glasses. I look flower power jeans and shirts or whatever. I must have looked like a relic from the 60s. So I don't think I was terribly taken seriously, but I did get to meet them, and I did some study with them. I was introduced to the idea of koans. I didn't know about koans. I mean, I've read about them, of course, in what is it, Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, and through Alan Watts and so forth. But they actually introduced me to koan practice.
How did you fund this trip? Because at this point you weren't working yet. Is that correct?
Right. Gosh, that's a great question.
And we're like, so you needed money to come out. You needed money to have a place to stay, or were you staying at the centers themselves, or how did that work logistically?
I love it. Yeah. So I came with enough money to last maybe a week. I didn't know that's all it was. And it was the unbelievable kindness of Californians. It was almost from the moment I stepped foot into on California soil, nobody let me pay for a meal. Nobody let me pay for a ride anywhere. Nobody let me pay for the night's stay. I was staying with friends in London, in LA, for free, not resident at ZCLA.
Mm-hmm.
And I was with a traveling companion, and we tried our utmost to get people to take our money. And after 3 months in the States, we still had most of our original money that really was only enough to last a week.
Mm-hmm.
It was a different time. It was an innocent time. And again, if you moved in those tail end of the flower power era circles, there were an awful lot of very generous people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was eye-opening for us. So I was, again, incredibly fortunate because I couldn't actually, with my own money, afforded to travel there and stay for as long as I did.
How long did you stay?
3 months in all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was the entire British summer time off from university, was basically the 3 months.
What was your impression of? So that was probably your first, because at the Priory, they did their kind of Anglican like liturgy and stuff. So this is probably your first introduction to kind of Japanese style Zen forms and so forth. What was your impression of that? As far as the chanting and the bowing and the liturgy and the strictness of the forms and so forth.
I loved it. I have to say that I was not at all sure about the concept of dharma names. And this is because I knew a lot of people who were in various Indian groups of one kind or another. I mean, it's also the era of the Maharaji, and the Beatles were peddling this guru or that guru, and everyone seemed to get a dharma name, an Indian dharma name. And so I had this thing about, well, I'm not going to have one of those. And it stayed with me for a very long time. But apart from that, I was immediately drawn to the Japanese aesthetic of the whole thing. That I love the formality. I think this is bound up partly by my being a scientist and an introvert, because we kind of like that stuff. I like that strict form. And I love the similarity to the Christian service, which it weirdly felt familiar to a Church of England service in many ways. But nobody was trying to tell me that it was, we were doing it because of some elderly gentleman sitting upstairs on a cloud directing all of us and making decisions on behalf of all of us. It was explained fairly early on why we were doing it, and that we aren't worshipping Buddha. So immediately, yes, I fell for it. I thought it was a fantastic. But it's still, I have to say at this point, I was still in my salad bar years, which is to say that although where I started with Zen, I think my real start with Zen was with Douglas Harding, although he doesn't claim to have any connection to a lineage. But he's probably one of the greatest Zen masters I've ever studied with. But the Soto Zen of what I later discovered was Meizumi, White Plum, Zen Center of Los Angeles, was kind of like Church of England for me. It became my home church, my home religion. And I think that, and it just goes to show my naivety, I didn't know there were any other forms of Zen. I think if you came into Zen through Alan Watts and D.T. Suzuki and so forth, it was very easy to, if you didn't dig deep enough, to just come away with the feeling that Zen is Japanese, and it's actually spelled Z-E-N, and that's it. And in fact, what we call Zen is actually Soto Zen. I had no knowledge there was Rinzai Zen. I had no idea that it began in China as Chan. I had no idea that Rinzai was really Linji, and that was Chinese too. So it was a revelation to me many, many years later that what I had thought of was Zen was just simply this one corner of the practice, which I had, for good or whatever, I had found a home found comfortable for me.
Great. Right. So you're done with your 3-month sabbatical in America. What came next for you?
So I came back and redoubled my interest in trying to run things in Leicester as close as we could to the way that I experienced them in ZCLA, which was obviously difficult. But it basically worked. We continued. I was at this point getting really pretty deep into my psychology studies. And as the next few years unfolded, I become drawn to studying autism, childhood autism. That was a fairly new area of interest in those days, back in the 70s. Some of the earliest work studying what is autism, how does it come about, started in those years. And that's when I segued into doing a PhD in autism at the University of London. When I got to London, again, could not find a Zen center anywhere. I later discovered that other people were attending Zen groups there, from what I hear. So I don't know. I certainly tried. I used to attend Quaker friends' meeting houses instead as a place to go and just sit quietly. And I found a flourishing Third Order of St. Francis group that would meet weekly, and we'd sit in silence. And it was very Zen-like, but it was their version. Very much like what some people now call centering prayer. And I got thrown into the world of autism, studying it, publishing papers on it, and so forth. Which I still have one toe in those waters. I still try to write on autism more. I recently republished my PhD thesis as a book, and in some ways it was, and it may sound odd, but in some ways it was related to my Zen, because autistic children see the world exactly as it is, and they have a tremendous trouble with constructs. So you show them two glasses, one's got a handle and it's got some dimples in it, another one's a straight, perfectly clear glass, and we call them both a glass, right?
Right.
They couldn't get that. These are two totally different objects to them. Why would you call them both a glass? And so I worked primarily with the most intelligent, high-end autism, people with autism. And it was fascinating because some of them had what we call islets of ability. One I worked with could remember every street in the whole of the UK. So he was an early GPS system. He's saying, I'm going to start in London in this street. I want to get to this street in Glasgow in Scotland. He would give you the whole route.
Was his first name Sherlock by chance?
And the kid was otherwise functionally subnormal. He could barely string a sentence together. But another one who could do amazing drawings. In fact, we even published a book of her drawings that were remarkably lifelike, even though she herself was very subnormal. And I got to study with some of the finest minds in the autism world. My PhD supervisor was somebody called Artie Hermlin, a German lady, who worked with her partner, Neil O'Connor, in the Child Development Research Unit, something like that, CDRU. I got all my money from the British Medical Foundation. They were so generous to me. They normally funded psychiatrists, and they funded my work. And I got to work at the Institute of Psychiatry with some fairly famous people in the autism world. So it was a time when my interest in autism took over, and I basically cruised through the 1980s, failing to find any Zen centers in London, having our own groups. And I was, my day job turned more into computer programming. Even my PhD thesis was about computerized eye movement studies of autistic children. So I was heavily into computing,
Mm-hmm.
building my own computers and things like that. And I've written a few books on computer programming.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody once told me a story that Queen Victoria read and adored Alice through the Alice in Wonderland and then Alice Through the Looking Glass, and she demanded that all of the books written by this Lewis, what was his name? Lewis Carroll, be brought to him. Of course, his real name is Charles Dodgson, and in the apocryphal story, a wheelbarrow full of books are wheeled into Queen Victoria. I have a feeling this story has holes in it. It may not have ever happened, but it's a nice urban myth. And she thought she was going to get a whole stack of Alice in Wonderland style books. And of course, the majority of his books were on mathematics. So I often think that if anyone reads a book at one of my Zen books, or they read my novel I've written a sort of science fantasy novel, and then they say, I want all the books by this Tim Langdell, they're going to get a bunch of very scientific how to program your computer books and be a little disappointed.
So what was your kind of next touch point with formal Zen practice?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, it was, again, the ways that interesting series of events. We were looking for a school for my daughter in the late 80s.
College or university?
Just gosh, her age at that point. So it would have been
pre-college,
junior, no, but even pre-high school.
Okay.
But the schools were still, good point, she's about 9. So, but it's, again, the British system, it has some parallels here to what I've experienced here. But if you don't get your kid into the right school that early on, you'll never get them into the other right school later on. And that is the school that's going to get them into college. I realized I was unbelievably lucky the way I got into college. It was already getting harder. And every school we visited, all the schools for boys had computers, and not one school for girls had computers. So we were in a financial situation to be able to send her to public school, a private school. But they were treating the girls as if they were going to just become social scientists or something. And we didn't know what potential our daughter had. As it happens, she has quite a scientific mind. And she gets more from me maybe than from my wife. She's now an Episcopal priest. But at that time, we couldn't be sure. So my wife telephoned the school that she went to in Pasadena, California, which was a
Is your wife American?
Yeah. She was born in Santa Monica and raised in Pasadena.
And did you meet her in England? Was she in England?
Yes. Again, complete random chance. She was, and again that I had got one toe in at University College London. I did reconnect as best I could with my Christian roots, and so I was one of the people helping to run the student church for University College, and I happened to be designated as the greeter for any new people turning up on the day that she turned up and tried out our church. So that's how we met. But I'm also the person who installed a pub in the basement of the Christian church to get more students to attend it on Sundays. So we had beer on tap as a way of, as an alternative to communion wine, yes. So I was a bit of a disruptor. But we got a lot of people attending it. I don't know why. So yes, we met in London. And so she, she called back to the school she attended and said, any chance you've got a space? And by some utter miracle, they said, yes, if you can get here next week. So we just packed everything into suitcases.
And this was by American standards, a private school in the United States.
Right. An all-girls private school that tends to graduate, kids from high school then go on to Ivy League. Many of them go on to Ivy Leagues. And so it was an opportunity we couldn't miss. As much as we love the British system at its best, it's absolutely fantastic. But we couldn't risk it because our daughter could have ended up in the less good channel. And once you're in that, it's really hard to get out into the better channel. It's hard to really explain.
I get it. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we had got them into one of the best schools in London, one where the Shah of Bahrain's kid was going to. It's just behind Harrods in Knightsbridge. But we couldn't necessarily get them into a good school from there. That was our main. Well, our son probably could, but our daughter, there was nothing happening. So we did a move to here. We had been bouncing backwards and forwards anyway because my wife's parents were here, and we spent part of the year in California, part in London already.
Okay.
So it wasn't quite as crazy as it might first sound, but it was a matter of, okay, now we live in the LA region. What does that mean? And I have to say, it took me the first 5 years of being here to settle down, try and work out what this new life I had. I became a college professor, which I hadn't really, that wasn't my primary duty before, primary job. So I started teaching computer programming design and things like that at the University of Southern California in the early 90s. And it was around about 1995 that I finally woke up and went, wait a minute, I'm back in LA where there's Zen Center Los Angeles, my home. Why have I not been going there? And it was an odd moment where I think I've been wandering in the desert for 40 days, and it was a lot more than 40 days. I think I was stuck in the acclimatizing myself to living in California versus London. I don't know. I could probably analyze myself on it, but for whatever reason, I chose to wait till 1995. And many of the people watching this or listening to this might know what that means because Maezumi died.
Yeah.
So I turn up at ZCLA just after his death. Hi, I'm here. And they went, not a good time. This is a bad time for us. Maezumi's just passed. It's a dark time. We do not recommend you come back here now. And I attended occasionally from 95 to about 2000. It's hard to recall all of those particular sessions, but my memory is that Bernie was running a lot of them.
When you say session, do you mean like session SESSION or
sorry,
session?
No, just sittings.
Okay.
Yes, I did attend Shashins during that period too. As I say, my memory is that Bernie was the primary teacher. Every time I met with anyone, it was only with Bernie, I think, from the best of my recollection. I don't remember any other teachers I met with. But I still was in that mode of, I'm still not sure about this Dharma name thing. It was still with me. I don't know. It's again. I still had the memories of many of my friends who got into a drug culture, got a Dharma name, and it kind of ruined their lives. So I think it had connotations to me that weren't really necessarily real, but they just had baggage to have a Dharma name. So I resisted it. I finally returned when Egyoku took over, and to a more regular attendance. And I remember that it was soon after she took over that I said, okay, I'll have a Dharma name. I'll go for it. So I talked to them about Jukai and taking the precepts and getting a Dharma name. I said, great, you've come at a great time because we decided to get rid of all the Japanese Dharma names and now it's only British, it's like English. Strip. English Dharma names. And I went, so you want to give me a name like Lily Pad or something? Or, sweet smelling lotus? I'll have to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually caused me to go away again. And I still look at that and wonder, why would that thing of a Dharma name have had such an influence over whether I regularly attended a place or not?
Mm-hmm.
And it just did. I then flash forward to 2009, I think. I was feeling a tremendous hole that in the center of my being that I needed to fill.
Mm-hmm.
And I was getting a little burnt out teaching as a professor. I enjoyed it. I valued the fact that students got value from what I did. I always loved the fact when they came back to me and said, if you hadn't said this to me, I wouldn't have done that. The fact that you can influence people's lives through teaching, I think is a real privilege. So I really did enjoy it, but somehow I felt there was something missing spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
So at about the same time, I started regular visits to ZCLA again, and that's when I stayed. And I recall a meeting with one of the teachers there where I said, it's really interesting. I feel like I truly have come home this time. I'm at ease with the idea of finally taking the precepts and getting a Dharma name. Apparently, you know our Japanese ones again, so that helps. I mean, and still, I'm not going to defend that. And I said it's rather like reaching into a wardrobe and pulling out an old pair of shoes that you haven't worn for many years and putting them on and finding how incredibly comfortable they are. And you asked me much earlier, what did I think about all the bells and whistles and bowing and chanting and formally sitting as Zazen? I felt incredibly at home with it, and I loved returning to it. And he just looked at me and smiled. And when I said it, it felt like I was putting on those old shoes again. And he just looked at me.
Who was the teacher?
His last name is back for Zen. Daishin, I think he also was called Daishin. He recently passed away. He's also an English guy.
And you took two class to him?
I didn't. I took it to another English lady at ZCLA called Shingetsu. And so Sensei Shingetsu. But when I told him about the shoes story, he said, he just smiled in a very sort of Zen master way and said, you never took them off. And it was that moment where I realized he's absolutely right. I wasn't putting back on something I'd taken off. I had never actually taken them off. But sorry, yes, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry. What was your practice during this time? Were you doing Shikantaza? Did you ever try koans with him? Or what was your kind of your rubber meets the road kind of practice during this period of your life?
So yes, so this is when I did the deep dive back into Zen, and it was regular attendance every week. It was Shikantaza. It was koan practice with several of the teachers there, Egyoku being the main teacher. For me, it became something I had to do every week. But there was as I started this, I had another, I don't know if I can call it Kensho experience. It was a semi-miraculous experience for me. At this point in time, I was a member of a wine aficionados group. I really liked my red wines. I had a nice little cellar of various vintages of red wine. I love single malt whiskies. I had quite a collection of Scotch whiskies.
What's your favorite red wine region?
It's kind of distant past now. So I can't really name them because of what happened next, which is, so I had a lot of collectible single malts. And my favorite meal if I went out was to have a steak or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
As I got back into this Zen practice, I woke up one morning. I used to drink a pot of coffee a day. I mean, at least one pot, all for myself. And as I woke up that morning, it was as if I'd never drunk alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
as if I'd never drunk coffee, and as if I'd never eaten meat. I had no withdrawal symptoms at all. It
Mm-hmm.
just, but I could suddenly, it became an intense problem for me to go into a supermarket because I could feel the pain of the animals as I got near
Mm-hmm.
the section with the meat. And it was as if coming back into Zen just opened me up totally.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never drunk alcohol since. I've never eaten meat since.
So you're vegetarian?
I'm a pescatarian.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way, apart from the fact that a pure vegetarian diet didn't agree with me, according to my doctor, I found that eating fish was, particularly salmon, seemed to work well in my diet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I sit with because I'm again, it's not entirely clear to me how I ended up where I am. It wasn't through a intellectual process of I don't believe in killing animals. I don't think Buddhists should eat animals. I didn't come in through that route. I just
Gut instinct.
It just I don't drink, and I walked through a liquor section, got no interest whatsoever in picking up a bottle. Whereas before, I used to study the bottles for the vintage in the area, and I would know off by heart which region I preferred and whether it's north facing slope and what years. I loved Imago, Chateauneuf de Pape, and so forth. But it's interesting. It just went away. And although I now drink a couple of cups of coffee a day, and I had to say addiction, because I felt addicted to alcohol, addicted. I didn't drink to excess. I just had some alcohol at weekends. I was so religious about having nothing during the week. But eating meat, drinking alcohol, drinking a lot of coffee were addictions.
Mm-hmm.
And as I did the deeper dive back into my Zen and was sitting regularly, doing koan work, it all went away.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, it just seems like a miracle. I don't know how it happened.
Yeah, I can relate to that actually. So you're practicing at Zen Center Los Angeles. Eventually, you moved on to Korean Zen. So can you talk a little bit about that transition there?
Yeah. So during this period, when I got back into ZCLA, I was casting around for how do I fill this space? I can't really figure out what this hole in me is, which feels like a spiritual calling, but I don't know what it's a calling to.
Mm-hmm.
And a few things happened. One was somebody suggested to me I might train to be a spiritual director. It's something within the Episcopal Church in particular, where you take on mentees and you mentor them in their walk in their spiritual path. You might be helping them to learn about different types of meditation or prayers or whatever helps them. And so I trained with that, and it sort of partly filled the hole. I became a certified, or whatever the term is, spiritual counselor. And I was at one of these trainings for that spiritual guidance training when I was having lunch, and one of the people around the table asked me an incredibly wise question. They said, casting your mind back, when did you feel most fulfilled with what you were doing? And without missing a beat, I said, I know this is going to sound strange, but while I was doing my Ph.D. in London all those years ago, I volunteered at the Children's Hospital on the leukemia ward, working with dying children. And to this day, that was the most meaningful thing I feel I've ever done in terms of avocational work or vocation. And they said, so why not become a chaplain? And I said, well, I can't. I'm not a priest. Only priests can become chaplains. That's what did I know? And the two of them looked at each other and they laughed, the two people sitting next to each other talking to me. And they said, well, we're both chaplains. She is not a priest and I am a priest, said the guy. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be a priest to be a chaplain. And they convinced me to take something called clinical pastoral education at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And that was another watershed moment for me. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like I'm not answering your question. In fact, you'll see where this is going. I started the work at Children's Hospital, and it was some of the most traumatic and devastating work I've ever done, mm-hmm. and some of those rewarding. And I feel very privileged to have done it. But I also felt this is it. I have to be a chaplain. So mm-hmm. I gave up the relatively lucrative college teaching, university teaching, and went back to square one, because when you're training as a chaplain, you have to do it for free. You aren't paid for it, mm-hmm. which was a real leap of faith to do that. And
was your wife established in a career that kind of gave you a little bit of a cushion there?
Right. She had pretty solid teaching. She was back in university teaching. Mm-hmm. Which, she's primarily an English professor, although she also teaches ESL, English as a second language. Mm-hmm. We had some savings, and we had my wife's work, so we could make it work.
Sounds like she was very supportive of all this.
Very, mm-hmm. Yes, incredibly grateful to my wife and her support through this whole thing. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I discovered early on was, well, it's in my nature. If I'm going to do something, I've got to really do it thoroughly, do a deep dive. And so I'm almost immediately said, okay, I'm going to become a board certified chaplain. Mm-hmm. I'm not just going to do this. In fact, it was partly in pushing back against my local Episcopal bishop, who was saying, fine, just do it, carry on with your college teaching and do this chaplain thing as a voluntary gig. Just mm-hmm. do it as a volunteer. And I said, no way. That chaplaincy is a real profession. And I feel called to it. It's my full-time profession. I've chosen it. And at that point, if you were going to become hired full-time in most hospitals in particular, you need to be a priest. Mm-hmm. And so I concurrently explored, okay, if I'm going to do a deeper dive into my Buddhism and I go back and do a deeper dive into my Christianity, how do I become a priest so that I can actually become a full chaplain? So that was kind of one of the driving, and am I called to it? Is this a genuine calling? Mm-hmm. So because I knew enough to know you don't go knocking on somebody's door and say, hi, will you make me a priest so that I can become a chaplain? That's even in the Christian world, they have the concept of gaining mind. You don't walk in and say, hi, make me a priest. It doesn't work that way. You go through a period of discernment. And I entered into discernment with the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. And I started attending the Episcopal Seminary, relatively local to us at Claremont here in Southern California. Part of Claremont School of Theology, but they've got their separate Episcopal seminary. Mm-hmm. And I found that there came a point where the Bishop of Los Angeles said, and a couple of other key priests who were gatekeepers, shall I say, between as to whether or not I would actually be given approval to go forward to become ordained. Mm-hmm. Basically said, we hear you also talk about Buddhism a lot. Gee, got out, did it? Yes, I said, I am a Buddhist. And they said, well, you can't be a Buddhist and a Christian at the same time. You have to give up the Buddhism if you want to become a priest. And there was not a moment's hesitation for me. That's not an option. I'm not giving up my Buddhism, become a Christian priest. Mm-hmm. So I asked around and said, is there any other branch of Christianity that will ordain somebody who feels called to become a chaplain. I was told about UUC and about the independent Catholic movement. And I found a home in the independent Catholic movement. And I am so incredibly lucky.
Universalist Unitarian Church, is that what you meant?
Yeah, sorry, yeah. And they were also very welcoming, but the independent Catholics, they were a perfect fit because they were not so interested in building congregations or having churches. All of them were either working in prisons or with the homeless or working as chaplains.
So very service-oriented.
Very service-oriented, social justice, very to the left of Episcopalians when it came to LGBT issues and so forth. Until recently, the head of that branch was one of the first gay priests. He marched in the famous marches in the 70s in favor of gays and lesbians as the only priest wearing a collar, as Bishop Clement. Wonderful man.
And you can I mean, obviously, your evidence that they allow married priests.
Exactly. Yeah, and that was the other great fit. They were like the Episcopalians in so far as they have being married is not a problem. Women priests, women bishops, completely open door. And they were doing it even before the Episcopal Church was doing it. They're lesser known. They were formed in response to the First Vatican Council, and they became formalized in 1915 as the Chicago Corporation, as the American Catholic Church. And it was originally conceived of as being just what it sounds like. You would have the Roman Catholic Church, and people in America would belong to that, but there'd be our own American Catholic Church. That was the idea behind it. I'm actually still on the board of trustees of that entity. I'm still one of the people running it. But I love their completely open arm welcome and their supportiveness. They said, we can hear it in your voice that you feel called to become a chaplain, and it is ridiculous that you should have obstacles in your way. So I became ordained through that system. But and this is telling you something about me. I was still, I would say, at least equally deeply into my Zen Buddhism. And so I cast around for how could one become a reverend in the Episcopal, in the Buddhist, in the Zen Buddhist world. I wasn't at all sure about becoming a certified chaplain as a Christian certified chaplain, because in many ways I feel that my chaplaincy is so intimately integrated with my Zen. Zen is what informs my chaplaincy first and foremost. It's a practice of presence, and chaplaincy done at its best is a practice of presence, of just being a non-judgmental presence of people. I cast around and found the program at Upaya in New Mexico, their Buddhist chaplaincy training. And a couple of us from Zen Center of Los Angeles took that program with Roshi Joan Halifax. Fantastic program, by the way. I loved every minute of it. And we both experienced an interesting end of it, because it was, everyone else in the program was made a lay priest, I guess, were lay ordained and became reverends. But my colleague and I from Zen Center of Los Angeles were not, because we were under Egyoko in LA and not under her in Santa Fe. So I found that rather strange. It is what it is, it just was okay, particularly because they're both White Plum, both CCLA and Upaya. And it was at that time I was talking with Jundo Cohen of Tea Leaf Sangha, and Brad Warner. And I said, okay, I have just spent the last couple of years thoroughly immersed in the idea of Buddhist chaplaincy. I need to pursue this. I feel called to go deeper in my Buddhist training.
Mm-hmm.
Who do I train with? And they both recommended this person called Wanji Dharma, Paul Lynch.
I want to go to that. Did you ever look into getting ordained via Zen Center Los Angeles, or would that would require too much like residential training and so forth?
Right. It's interesting, and I'm still to this day trying to get my head around how things fully work at ZCLA. I thought I knew it. I did discuss it with Egyoku, and her response was that first of all, she doesn't. It's actually rather like the Episcopal response now I think about it, because the Episcopal bishop said we don't ordain anyone to become a chaplain. And other Episcopal priests told me, oh, no, you must say that you want to run a congregation. And then after you get ordained, you have to have a revelation that you really want to become a chaplain. That's how you become ordained as a chaplain. And I said, well, I'm not prepared to lie. I'm sorry, that doesn't sound like the right way to do things. With Egyoku, again, she said, we don't really have any support for chaplaincy. There was a prison ministry that had been run out of ZCLA for quite a long time, wonderful ministry. But there was no real support for chaplaincy. And this isn't unique to ZCLA. It may sound like that was a criticism, but it's not, because many Zen centers across the United States do not have any infrastructure to support chaplaincy. And if you, many of the people I spoke to, and Egyoku was just one of them, who would say, no, if you're going on the priest path, you're going to become a priest, right? I mean, you and I know this because we're priests in the Matsuoka lineage. You don't go on the priest path to become a chaplain. It just doesn't happen virtually anywhere. And back then, it didn't happen anywhere, as far as I know. Or you go on a teacher path to become a sensei and do koan work with people. But there wasn't a path to actually to advance in to go deeper in your Buddhism, in your Zen, to become a priest or a teacher or whatever, with the calling to chaplaincy. And so it's a long way of putting it. So Egyoku said, normally any of the priests, I've worked with them in their priest training for typically about 10 years. And part of that is living here at the center, becoming a head priest at the center, running services at the center.
Whereas you were more narrowly focused on being a chaplain specifically.
I was already working as a chaplain, so giving up the chaplaincy work to go and train at ZCLA for 10 years was not an option, really. So, and I get it, and it's why, jumping forward, it's why I created the Buddhist Chaplaincy Endorsement entity. We act as an endorsing entity for Buddhist chaplains throughout all flavors of Buddhist chaplain throughout the United States, because so many centers don't have this support for Buddhists becoming chaplains. I'm also a co-chair of the Professional Chaplains Association's Buddhist Task Force, and we were successful in the last few years in changing all of their paperwork to get rid of the purely Christian references, so that there could also be a Buddhist application form that didn't have the Buddhist applicant for certification as a chaplain asking you who your bishop is, how often you attend church, who can recommend you at your church. We did that. So it led me to this character, Wanji Dharma, who was in the Sangson Korean tradition and the Thich An Vietnamese tradition. a refreshing change, similar but very different from my Soto experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself loving, still feeling at heart Soto. There's something about kind of your home tradition that never quite goes away. But loving the exploration, particularly of the Korean tradition and Sang-sun's teaching. One of the major differences was that a typical Dokusan session at Zen Center of Los Angeles, or any of the other White Plum centers I'd ever done Dokusan at, could last as few as 20 seconds or maximum 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You go in, you do a bow, you say your dharma name, you say what koan you're working on, and you present on the koan. And the teacher might ring their bell within seconds of you doing or saying something.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if they're looking for a non-verbal answer the moment you speak, it rings. You have no idea why they've rung the bell. They don't give any feedback.
Well, I've been rung out before I've even sat down before.
Right. you know the feeling, right?
Yeah.
The first session I had with Wanji Dharma, first Dokusan, an hour long. And I said, "Where's your bell? Why aren't you ringing me out?" He said, how would we get anywhere if I rang you out after 20 seconds or before you've even sat down?
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a refreshing, different way of doing things, that it was a weekly check-in to see how each of us are doing, not just me. And we cover at least one koan a week.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, I got further with him in the koan curriculum in the first month than I had in 20 years in all the other koan practice I've been doing at any other center.
So I have a question about koan. So I'm very ignorant about Korean koan practice. So
right,
bear with me with maybe some naive questions. But so in Japanese Renzai and then the kind of parallel Harada Yasutani traditions, there's a set curriculum, right? There's the breakthrough koan, and then there's then there's checking questions, and then there's the miscellaneous questions, and then depending on your lineage, you either go through the books or it's kind of random. But there's a set order of koans you go through. Is the Korean tradition similar?
It is. I've not studied within the Kwanum tradition, which is probably the most prevalent Korean tradition, but I know that Wonji was part of the Kwanum tradition and study with Sang-sun and also with other Kwanum teachers. And yes, there is a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And just very briefly, Zen, or Chan as it was known in China, spreads to Japan partly as Soto through Dogen and partly as Rinzai, with the one tradition being focus on Zazen, Shikantaza, the other one focus on koan work, right? What passes to Korea is primarily the Linji tradition, the koan work. Mm-hmm. So it has a lot of connections to the roots in Linji and therefore Rinzai. Mm-hmm. Such that have led to speculation, did Sang-sun study with Rinzai teachers in Japan? And we're still not sure if he did. Mm-hmm. But the curriculum is remarkably similar. There are, it varies, but there are the breakthrough koans that have a lot in common with the ones you might study in Rinzai, as I understand it, or Yasutani Harada. Tremendous amount of overlap. So a number of those, several tens of those, and then studying pretty much the same collections of koans. So Gateless Gate, Blue Cliff Record, Book of Serenity, and in total about 1,400 koans. So I did the whole curriculum with Wonji Dharma. Mm-hmm. And graduated it. And then received, I went up through the ranks of being given dharma holder to senior monk to Inca, to the equivalent of Inca Shamai, which we call it becoming a Sonsonim, which is in Korean is simply Zen master. And what I loved about it was Sangsang's approach to koans. And it's unique. I have questions about that koan curriculum approach, and I think there are huge benefits of it as well. Did you have any questions on that? Because I was going to talk about what happened next.
Yeah, sure. So you're now an assistant teacher in the White Plum curriculum through.
Right. I was going to cut to that because
I have a specific question. So I'm curious. So there's kind of the, I don't even know how to. I don't want to say expected answer because obviously there's some flexibility, but let's say that so have you found that there's how divergent is the kind of, I don't know way of saying this that kind of encapsulates all the different ways you can approach koan, but I mean, is there a similar understanding of a particular koan in both the Korean lineage and what you see in the White Plum? Like, let's say the flagpole, I mean, is the approach to the koan the same in both traditions, or do they totally diverge?
The short answer is there are some koans where the approach is almost identical, but there are an awful lot of them where the approach is quite different. And having completed the Korean curriculum, sadly, Wanji Dharma Paul Lynch passed away in December, and that left me without a teacher. And I do think it's extremely important, no matter that everyone have a teacher. And so I was looking around for somebody who could teach me, who could continue. And I was particularly interested in exploring Harada Yasutani koan curriculum, being my roots at ZCLA, I suppose is one way of looking at it. I wasn't drawn to going back to ZCLA because they still had the same format that I got better acquainted with James Ford, who we know and love, and did some koan work with him just to get a taste of what the Yasutani Harada curriculum was like with him. He still tends to teach in a similar way. I mean, you're not going to have an hour with James. It's more likely a few minutes of Doksan. And that's fine. That's just one way of approaching it. And somebody mentioned that you might find an interesting new home with Al Rappaport, the Roshi at Open Mind. And when I said why, they said, well, he also talks with you for it's more like 30 minutes, but he isn't going to do 20 seconds to ring the bell. I thought, okay. And it's been a wonderful fit because he's enabled me to go through what is essentially the Yasutani Harada koan curriculum. And I just love exploring with him how, I mean, a typical session will work on a koan and I'll say, well, this is what the Korean way of responding to this would be. And it didn't take me too long to work out that is not what I now call the Soto approach. And it's, of course, not Soto, but saying Yasutani Harada every time is a little bit of a mouthful.
You just say White Plum.
No, it could say White Plum, I suppose. Yeah. And so there is a distinct difference in the way that you approach koans, and both have merit. And what I'm loving is that I now have both types of approaches to koan work in my tool bag, as it were. So when I work with students, I can vary it depending on whether I think that student's going to get more from the Korean approach or from the White Plum approach. I do on average, prefer the White Plum approach. Sansan had some wonderful insights, but there are a few times when I think that Sansan's approach might have been a little bit too in the head, which is not what we're trying to do. But yeah, I'm not saying a whole lot more than that, because like Fight Club, we don't talk about koans.
Right. So I try to keep these under 2 hours. And there's two things I want to talk to you about. So if I could direct the conversation a little bit at this point. The first is we touched upon it at the beginning of the interview, kind of the, essentially the cosmological worldview of Buddhism and Christianity. So first of all, I'd like to know, many of, I've been involved with Zen, through various traditions for about 32 years now. And teachers I've worked with have ranged from, seem to fully believe in transmigration and karma, to other teachers I've had, are essentially, they're almost atheist, and so I'd be curious to, if you feel comfortable sharing, kind of what's your cosmological view of the universe,
right.
And how do you rectify which, on the surface seems to be extremely divergent views of the afterlife in Buddhism and Christianity, being that you're essentially a priest in both. Like, I'd really like you to kind of dive into that a little bit if you're up for it.
Right, I'd love to, actually. And the time has gone way faster than I thought it was going to go. So yes, it is one of my main, as I said near the beginning, one of my main soapboxes, one of the things I like talking on the most, and why I wrote the Christ Way, Buddha Way book. One way of looking at it is to say that if you talk to me about Christianity, you're going to hear a very Zen version of Christianity. But I would defend that by saying that I'm actually gone back to what Jesus actually taught, as far as we know. It isn't what is spoken about in churches usually. So we go back to what he actually taught. A little bit of academic work needed to get there. This isn't my personal opinion is it's an attempt to actually look at it and analyze it in a historical context, looking at which of the books of the New Testament were written first, when were they written, how reliable are they, were they later amended, things like that. And we find a few things that I believe are fact. I think a lot of theologians agree with it. It's that these facts are taught in many seminaries, even though the priests who then graduate don't say it in church. And these facts include things like, one of the most egregious mistranslations in the New Testament is the word metanoia. It's translated as sorry, now I'm blocking on the word.
Is Messiah?
No, as to repent. Finally got that. Repent. This time, I'll blame it on the time change. So it's translated as repent or repentance. So there's the famous lines from the New Testament that are along the lines of, if you repent your sins, you'll go to heaven after you die. It becomes one of the central tenets of Christianity. However, it's not what Jesus said. Metanoia, meta means above or beyond, and noia means thought or thinking. So what he actually taught, and it's right there in the New Testament, just isn't repeated this way, is that you need to have a euphoric experience, a transformative experience that takes you beyond thought in order to become one with heaven within you. And he talks about whereas heaven is actually described as being within you, not some place you go to after you die. Jews to this day don't tend to believe in an afterlife. Jews of the first century wouldn't believe in heaven after you die.
They didn't.
So generally don't.
So that's not in the Torah at all. There's no afterlife in the Torah.
I mean,
or maybe it's like
my brothers and sisters, the Jewish tradition, welcome to correct me, but my understanding is Jewish tradition isn't about an afterlife. You're not trying to get into a place called heaven. Jesus talked about heaven within. He talked about the parts, the miraculous births were written many, many years after his death, and they were added to the original stories. If you look at the original story, original book of Mark as it was written, it is a collection of teachings, and the teachings are very Zen-like. He used parables. At least 1/3 of his parables were Indian parables from 50 to 100 years or more before his birth. So the parable of the wayward son is an Indian parable, and he reworked it for first century Palestine for his audience. Walking on water was a common story in the Indian stories, and he reworks that for the New Testament. So there's a tremendous amount of Buddhist thought in what Jesus taught. He only taught one practice, and that practice was to go somewhere on your own to pray, not with words, and to the term was of sorry, I'll get there in a second. Kenosis, self-emptying, is mentioned. So the idea was to
is that mentioned explicitly in the New Testament?
It's in Paul.
Okay.
Primarily, Paul says Jesus went to a place on his own and emptied himself in order to make himself one with God. But Jesus talks about the only practice he really talks about. There's all the Sermon on the Mount and so forth about what you should do, how you should treat other people. But the only practice he talks about is going somewhere on your own and praying without words, in silence, and this whole idea of self-emptying. It's also right there that anyone can become a son of God. It's not just him. In fact, every time they ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" he basically says, "Who do you say I am?" He dodges the question. So he never once says he's the Son of God.
So an often quoted, I'm not going to verbatim, but an often quoted passage of the New Testament is Jesus saying, there is no way to heaven except through me. What is it exactly? Like how would you interpret that in the context of what you're saying?
So there's a wonderful group called the Jesus Seminar who went back and researched the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Also Book of Acts as well, and the writings of Paul. And they tried to, Paul never met Jesus, so there's no verbatim quote from Jesus in Paul, of course. And they tried to rank every saying or utterance attributed to Jesus in order of almost certainly did say it, through may have said it, all through to almost certainly did not say it. You've quoted from John. John was written almost 100 years after he died, 70 years after he died.
After John died or after Jesus
after
died?
Jesus died. Yeah, and John didn't write it. Mark didn't write Mark. Matthew didn't write Matthew. Luke didn't write Luke. And John didn't write John. We don't know who the authors were. There were several authors that edited and changed things. They got given the names of disciples just as a label, but they weren't written by the disciples. And John was written much, much later. I used to love John the most because it's got all this wonderful opening to it. It sounds very mystical. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and it's all very mystical. But in John is some of the worst attributions to Jesus there are, and that's one of them, because it's absolutely central to his teaching in the earlier Gospels, the ones that were certainly written. Their first edition, as it were, was written very shortly after he died, and parts of it may have been while he was still alive, the sayings. And where he's saying clearly, we're all equal in this heaven within, right? If you attain this state of oneness, this metanoia, then we're all equal. And it's direct connection. I mean, he teaches a prayer, says our Father. He doesn't say teaches a prayer, says my Father. You could get to the Father only through me. He never once talks like that. And so what he's teaching, and many of the parables are about becoming as a young child. In other words, that beginner's mind, that seeing the world through a child's eyes, becoming childlike, not childish, in order to realize oneness with God and the heaven within. So if you, as I do, translate the heaven within to be realizing your true nature, that can show Satori experience. And interestingly enough, in the session we had with Open Mind Zen yesterday, somebody very bravely gave a talk on God. And there was quite a few of us who were saying, yes, but what's the common thread here is a feeling of a presence. The center of our being is a presence. I label it with words like compassion. A Christian might say it's love, pure, unselfish love. The Buddhist terminology seems a better fit to be compassion. So that one's true nature is that of compassion. And the difference then becomes semantic. You know, that the essence of who we are is a presence. And if you want to give that a label and call it God, that's one way to go. If you want to call it your true nature, your Buddha nature, that's another way to go. But experientially, I think it starts feeling to me, and I believe I'm not alone, more of a semantic difference than an actual experiential difference. And so in many ways, I find it a pity that Christianity is not taught the way that Jesus taught it in the first century, is the short version.
So would, true or false, so talk of the afterlife in the Bible is a mistranslation or misunderstanding. You don't think you don't see it as an ontological metaphysical reality.
One thing I love about Zen is the focus on what do I find true here and now? What is true for me? And if you ask me, do I find an afterlife here and now? I have to say no. Do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe you go somewhere else after you die? I don't know. I haven't died yet. The classic Zen master response. I do know that it is a misunderstanding of many early teachings, and it unfortunately played into the idea of a church controlling its people, because you can control them if they have to attend church. And remember, they had to pay to attend church. It was mandatory to attend church, and they had to pay. So it was a way that the church was making money. And then to have them have to, particularly if you start introducing another concept that isn't in the Bible, like purgatory or something, where there's this midway stage where you have to pay to get out of purgatory and get into heaven, that you can make it a sin-based theology. So it all becomes about sin. You're a sinner, you're born a sinner, you have to repent your sins, then you'll go to a place called heaven after you die. The very first gospel, Mark, ended with the two women discovering the empty tomb. There's no resurrection. There's no sighting of him being seen 3 days later in the very first writing. All that gets added later. So I don't, and again, everyone needs to be free to have their own theology, their own spiritual path, their own interpretation of all this. It's not for me to push my own personal understanding onto anyone else. But speaking from myself, I love the fact that Zen focuses on what's true for me here and now in this moment.
Yeah, the parable of Adam and Eve. First time I read that, I was already, a Zen practitioner, I guess. I was in college though,
Yeah.
I remember thinking like, wow, like this really seems to get at the kind of the human condition where if you look at it as a metaphor or parable, there's, originally we're in grace, but then we have access to knowledge, or conceptual thinking, and that causes sin and problems. And then you need to get back to, I mean, that seems really to kind of diagnose the human condition pretty accurately. I
As
think
long
it's
as yeah, like many of the things in many of the great religious works, including the Pentateuch, the First Testament, Old Testament, in some people speak. As long as you accept that they were speaking metaphorically and not literally, there's a tremendous amount of wisdom. And there's a great British poet whose name I'm also blocking on right now, introduced us to the idea of innocence, experience, and radical innocence. And that to me is a parallel to what you were just talking about. We are born into the world not knowing anything. It's a great jumble at first. We have the innocence of the newly born child, but we have to go through that experience. We have to eat from the tree of knowledge. We have to divide the world up into objects and things in order to become a functioning human being. The way I put it is that it's all very well to try and live in some highfalutin Zen world in which you just see things exactly as they are without any constructs, but that shape that's getting larger and larger and that sound that's getting louder and louder, unless you've learned it's a Mack truck heading towards you and you're on a road, you aren't going to jump out of the way. You're going to get killed by the Mack truck. That all of these concepts are really important to us to become a functioning human being. But we then kid ourselves it's all real. All these concepts are actually real things, but they really are individual objects separate from other objects. There really are emotions, colors, states. Things are better than something, things are worse than something, all these value judgments. And what Zen to me is all about is getting back to that radical innocence, back to that beginner's mind. It's so well put by Suzuki. I like that term. I'm not sure if he really coined it first, but I love it. Getting back to that preconceptual, before thought state of being.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. So I wanted to talk quite a bit about your chaplaincy. Can we break off to a part 2 sometime soon where we have a podcast just on that, so we don't try to rush it and shoehorn it right here? Would that work for you?
It would work very well. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd like to do one on chaplaincy.
I'm thinking about it. There's probably like a half an hour at least of stuff I'd like to talk about, and we've just kind of run out of time here. So like pretty much as soon as you're available, I'd really like to do a part 2 to kind of just focus on the chaplaincy.
I'd love to do that too. Okay. Thank you. Great. Yeah. Very much.
So wrapping up here, so if someone want to reach out to you about anything we've talked about, what's the best medium for touching base with you?
So probably the quickest way is through going to the website at StillCenter.org. That's got the contact details there. And I can be reached in a number of different ways. One is Rev Tim Langdell at gmail.com. Another one is Tim Ryuko at gmail.com. A welcome contact. We have our regular weekly Zen meetings on Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. Pacific, on Zoom, and the Zoom link is on the website. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to contact and always welcome contact from people.
And I guess now officially you could offer Open Mind Koan curriculum training.
Yes, so I can do Koan curriculum training. I can do the full Korean curriculum training, and a large part of the Open Mind Harada Yasutani. And I have a number of novice priests who are working towards priesthood in the Matsuoka lineage that you and I are part of, Soto-related priesthood. So I have a number of people working towards priests, and I'm still working with some people in the Korean tradition towards teachers, priests, whatever.
And if somebody wanted to be a chaplain, can you help someone along that path as well?
Yes, and in fact, that's one of the main jobs I'm doing, as well as my full-time day job being as a chaplain. I work as a mentor for chaplains. So I run this Buddhist chaplaincy endorsement program. And to me, it's a full mentoring program. So I'll take the person, will not only endorse them to the certifying body as somebody that we will stand behind, but I'll also mentor them on how to tell their story in such a way that they are more likely to get certified, because many people are not used to writing this stuff. So we give support all the way through the certification. And then beyond that too, I like meeting with people at least once a year just to check in. And just to know there's a group of chaplains who are here to share, frankly, the trauma of being a chaplain. It's a trauma. It's work that involves trauma every day.
Yeah, and we'll get into that in detail on our next session. Okay,
exactly.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.